Welcome. My name is Mary Ann, and I'm going to tell you the story of Jane and the water. So get comfortable and settle in. It had been a busy day at work, and Jane looked forward to curling up with a book and her cat, Fred. As she stepped out onto snow-covered streets, she was glad she wore her wool coat. She had purchased it at a vintage store many years ago, and it stood the test of time. The bright gold buttons still shone, and her green wool scarf that she wrapped around her neck kept her nice and warm. Boarding the bus, she found a seat by the window and settled herself. Though the steam on the windows made it impossible to look outside, she enjoyed watching droplets of water fall and slowly trace them with her eyes. She could feel herself beginning to nod off. Each time the bus came to a stop, she felt the pull forward and her head bobbed. It wouldn't be long before Jane was fast asleep. Soon she was dreaming of her childhood. She was about 9 years old and was walking home from school down the long country road. The houses in her neighborhood were spaced far apart, but close enough that you saw and knew your neighbors. The open fields were covered in a blanket of sparkling snow. The sun shone, and Jane skipped as she walked. She had her white galoshes on with the silver buckles. When her galoshes were wet and the sun hit them, the buckles shone like chrome. Maple and oak trees populated the field, but her favorite tree was the weeping willow. She watched the long hanging branches dance and sway in the afternoon breeze. They moved so gracefully, it was calming and hypnotic. It was late February, and the sunny day made her look forward to spring, when she would take a snack and her favorite book and sit beneath the low-lying branches of the willow tree, reading and daydreaming. Today the snow still covered the ground. Jane liked the crunching sound it made as she walked. There were small patches of ice in places, and she stopped to press the toes of her boot into the ice, cracking the top layer, making pretty patterns on it. Now she could see her house in the distance. It looked like the perfect little cottage. She lived there with her mother, father, and their dog named Jump. They got Jump when she was only 4 years old, and she named him. He was a brown chocolate Labrador with a very sweet temperament. As you can imagine, Jump never stopped jumping. As she got closer to her house, she could see the figure of her mother through the front screen door, looking out at the garden. Her mother was an avid gardener, and in the warmer months she would often find her puttering around outside. Her mother spent hours weeding, pruning, and adoring the property. In summer, the front garden was lush with greenery, roses, sunflowers, wildflowers, and lavender. On a breezy day, you could smell the fragrance far down the road. Her mother had even won a prize one year for her astoundingly tall sunflowers. However, today the garden was covered in snow, and the bird feeder swayed and creaked as Jane approached the front door. The screen door was covered in steam, which meant her mother was probably busy in the kitchen preparing dinner. She was an excellent cook. On cold days like these, she would often prepare soup and bake bread. Fresh bread was Jane's favorite, especially when it was hot. Her mother was in the kitchen, clad in an apron, when she walked in. Jump barked, ran, and jumped up to greet Jane. Jane removed her coat and boots, placed her hat and mittens in the basket in the front hallway, and sat down at the old pine table. She then went over to the sink to wash her hands before being reminded. Her mother was pleased and smiled. She then proceeded to pour Jane a mug of hot cocoa. Jane was pleased to find a few small marshmallows floating around in the sweet, warm drink, and her mother had also laid out some homemade shortbread cookies on a plate. Her mother baked daily. She could often be found making cookies, pies, loaves, muffins, tarts, and even scones. The scent of baking and cooking filled the house with a palatable warmth. On Jane's 8th birthday, she had a tea party. 6 of her friends came, and they drank from real china cups. Her mother had made proper tea sandwiches shaped in triangles. These were laid out on tiered trays on the table. Jane had purchased big fun hats and boas for all her friends to wear, and they sat and ate and giggled. There were blueberry scones, cranberry scones, plain scones, and her absolute most favorite, caramel sea salt. Her mom even went so far as to make clotted cream and homemade raspberry jam. Her birthday cake was a delicious strawberry shortcake. It had been a great afternoon, and thinking about it now made her smile. She finished her cookies, brought her plate and mug to the sink, and headed downstairs to watch television. Jump followed. When she got downstairs, the room was entirely different. It was then that she remembered she was dreaming. The basement, where her living room used to be, was now a pond. She sat down next to the pond and looked at the water. She could see her reflection. The water trickled and flowed over rocks, and the sound soothed her. She lay down by the pond and fell asleep. When she woke, she found she was floating in the water. Her body was buoyant, and she felt soothed as the waves rocked and moved her. She could feel the warmth of the sun above her. She opened her eyes, and the sky was a beautiful blue. It stretched as far as she could see, and she heard gulls crying in the distance. She felt safe, free, and at peace here, floating on the water. The water was warm, and as she floated along, letting the waves carry her, she was soothed once more by the melodic caress of the water. She then felt something tap her on her shoulder. She had fallen asleep on the bus. It was the last stop. She exited the bus and stepped out onto snow-covered streets. As she headed back toward her apartment, she listened to the snow crunch underfoot, remembering the dream. She remembered how safe she felt floating in the water. She smiled and thought of her mother. She would call her tomorrow and relay the dream. Though it was now dark, many homes on the street were decorated with festive, multicolored lights. It was that time of year. They sparkled, and the snow appeared to change color beneath them. It was pink, green, and yellow. On nights like these, Jane used to like to take photographs. She picked up photography as a hobby many years ago and never grew tired of it, though it had been some time since she pulled out her camera. As she walked, she noticed how beautifully the snow draped itself on the bare branches of trees. Other trees were decorated with oversized sparkly ornaments and bows. Jane looked up at the sky. On cold nights like this, the sky appeared more clear and crisp. The moon hung in its silver perch, and a few stars shone brightly. As Jane walked up the pathway to her apartment, she could see the shadow of Fred sitting on the top of the radiator, behind the curtains, waiting for her. She entered the building, pressed 5, and in no time was up at her door, turning the key. Fred meowed loudly as she entered. Fred was a large, oversized orange tabby who liked nothing more than to curl up in Jane's lap. Jane picked Fred up in her arms, kissing him on his nose. His fur was soft and warm from laying atop the blanket she laid out for him on the radiator. She hung up her coat and hat, took off her boots, then headed into the kitchen. Taking some leftover chicken soup out of the fridge, she poured it into a small pot and lit the gas stove. She then set a place for herself at the small kitchen table. Even though Jane lived alone, she always liked to set the table properly. She pulled the white linen tablecloth that she bought at the antique market last summer from the drawer. She then retrieved a cloth napkin, folded it into a triangle, and laid a soup spoon upon it. She then poured herself a tall glass of water and retrieved a tin of cat food from her pantry. Fred knew the sound of the electric can opener and ran to her side, purring, moving in and around her legs as she emptied the contents of the tin into the bowl. In no time, the soup was warm, and Jane poured ladles full into her bowl. Setting the soup down, she watched as steam rose and twirled. She had a habit of eating hot things too quickly, and was sure to give the soup a few moments to cool down so as not to burn her tongue. It was her mother's recipe. She ate slowly and mindfully, enjoying and savoring each and every spoonful. She also made herself a couple of slices of toast. She buttered the toast, watching it melt into the bread. This was just the meal she wanted on a cold winter's night. Fred ate in the corner next to her. After cleaning up the dishes, Jane went to her bedroom to change into her pajamas. The flannel pajamas were a birthday gift from her aunt. They were so cozy, and she loved the fact that they were patterned with images of cats on skis. Making her way into the living room, she sat down on the soft velvet couch, and Fred joined her. Fred purred softly as he curled himself up into a ball on her lap. She felt content, calm, and at peace. From her living room window, she looked down at the street. She watched large snowflakes float gingerly toward the ground. Jane often sat in this spot, looking out the window. It was the perfect place to sit and watch the world go by. Jane had a vivid imagination. She would often sit on the couch and make up stories about the people walking by. As she watched the large snowflakes fall, she closed her eyes and imagined that she lived in a snow globe. In her mind's eye, she envisioned clear, rounded glass surrounding her and Fred. Inside the snow globe, they would be seated. Fred beside her on the couch, like they were now. She would have a book in hand, or there might be a small table with a lamp on it, like the one beside her. A small child would come along and shake the snow globe. Jane and Fred would remain steadfast, firmly in place. There might even be one of those knobs that you turn and music plays. Maybe something from The Sound of Music, like My Favorite Things. As the child put the snow globe down, large flurries would fall softly around Jane and Fred. Daydreaming came easy to Jane. As a child, she often made up stories and wrote them in journals, which she kept in a large pink box beneath her bed. As a matter of fact, she still had the box with all of the journals. She decided to go to her bedroom and pull one or two from the box. Opening the box, she spotted a brown leather-bound journal. Gracing the front cover were words meant to inspire, create, work hard, take chances, embrace possibility. Her mother often gave her journals as gifts, as she knew how much she loved to write. Opening the journal up, she recognized her own handwriting. She remembered the time spent as a child sitting by the pond near her house. She would listen to the water flow. This is where this particular story began. The young girl sat by the water, and it soothed her. The water had a voice only the young could hear. The water asked the girl to sit with it in quiet. She was instructed to close her eyes and trust the water. It would take her where she wanted to be. With her eyes closed, the young girl listened and began to feel herself float away. She felt weightless as the water carried her and gave in to this feeling. She could hear the rhythmic sounds of the waves kissing the shoreline. The sun warmed her, and she gave herself over to the water, and soon they became one. She was part of the flow. As she breathed, she could feel the water move inside and around her. Beautiful turquoise blue and gold fish swam with her. She could feel their freedom. In the distance, she heard what sounded like a song. This beautiful music carried her, and she continued to drift easily, peacefully. She wanted to stay here, floating forever, carried by the weightless buoyancy of the water. She could hear the breeze blowing in the trees. Peace was all around and inside her. She drifted and drifted, moving with the water, easily falling away to the water, feeling the waves take her over. Here she drifted forever